Hello, I'm retired General Lewis Mackenzie. Throughout Canada's military history, the militia has played an absolutely key role. Regiments are located across this country, and each one has responded in times of need when the bugle called. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, affectionately known as the Hasty Peas, is one of those units. Modest in character, yet they have been awarded more battle honors than any other Canadian unit. Theirs is a story of commitment, dedication, bravery, and sacrifice under some of the worst conditions that war can offer. I'm extremely pleased to introduce you to the history of the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment at war.
That's the secret. I think it is what a great adventure, it was for a lot of us, eh? And we didn't know any better. The Germans used to ask us, is it true you're all volunteers? They didn't think we were that crazy. We said, yeah.
We weren't fighting for our $1.50 a day. We were fighting for a cause.
Yes, we were a D-Day Dodger. But I think we fought just as hard and a little longer than the fellows that were at D-Day.
World War II was certainly worth what happened because the Nazi regime was a very, very wicked regime.
And all through Sicily and Italy, there was never a battle that the Canadians were not involved, and in most cases in the forefront. Every battle of the 8th Army, the Canadians were in the forefront. And they were faced with lack of food, lack of ammunition, in a lot of cases obsolete equipment. Never stationed in a town, always in the bush or under canvas. And at times it does get cold in sunny Italy. The main thing, of course, the lack of reinforcements. Everybody was doing double duty, etc.
Men in old World War I uniforms and rusty rifles have gathered on the shores of Lake Ontario in Prince Edward County. It is 1933, and they have come again to play war. Here they train for a war that Canadian politicians had said would never come. Most of these men fought in World War I and know better. Politicians between 1919 and 1939 wanted to disarm Canada. The men of the militia were not deluded. They trained without boots, without weapons, and most often without pay. Their only mode of transportation were their own cars and trucks. Against a countrywide apathy, they trained, survived, and perpetuated the Canadian regiments. War came again in 1939. Canada was caught in a state of complete unpreparedness. The regular army was down to 4,261 soldiers. However, the play soldiers stood ready, 51,000 of them. Despite the government's decades of neglect and ill will, the spirit of the militia stood strong.
What an experience for a young lad, you know, a teenager. And it's stamped in your mind for the rest of your life. You can forget about everything else, but you don't forget war.
The Canadian government turned towards these civilian soldiers and asked them to mobilize for war. On September 2nd, 1939, the Hasty Peas received its mobilization orders 8 days before the government declared war. Canada officially declared war on Germany on September the 10th, 1939. It would be 4 months of chronic shortages in uniforms, weapons, and ammunition.
There was guys that had partial uniforms. Some were wearing breeks and the old tunic with the brass buttons. Some were wearing coats and no pants, no shoes. It was kind of rough at the start.
For my first job was to see that our machine shop made some head badges for the Hasty Peas, because in those days it was very rough to get any part of equipment, because the militia and the reserves had been very neglected at that time.
Every day we go for maybe 10 or 15 mile route march. In the afternoon, probably some physical training, getting us in shape, like studying the maps, compass, things like that, but very little weapons training, because they didn't have any weapons for us.
The regiment during these days learned to fight trench warfare and dug trenches by the mile. Little did the men know that their leaders had no idea of what to do. As Hitler's blitzkrieg exploded over France, the regiment was into a full-scale 1918 trench warfare system. Hitler had destroyed the doctrine of static defense, and this truth took quite a while to affect decisions made by the High Command. It would be a costly mistake. Hitler's army halted at the Channel. It was believed that he was planning an invasion of England. The Home Guard came into being and turned the southern countryside into an armed camp. Static defense turned into flexible defense. The lessons of World War I were abandoned and new techniques were improvised. Battle exercises were a daily routine. On September the 8th, 1940, the code word for invasion, Cromwell, was sounded. The 1st Brigade of the 1st Canadian Division, which consisted of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the 48th Highlanders, and the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, stood ready for 10 days, but the invasion never came. What followed was nearly 3 years of training and defending an anticipated German invasion of England. The invasion would never come. The spring of 1941 saw the 1st Division come under the direct control of General Bernard Montgomery. Monty immediately stepped up the training and instituted drills that actually used live ammunition. It was dangerous work, but undeniably gave the men a taste of the real thing. In April 1943, the unit was moved to Scotland to train for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Winston Churchill believed that Italy was the soft underbelly of Germany and, if taken, would achieve 3 things. Would make Mediterranean communications more secure, would intensify the pressure on Italy, then Germany's ally, and divert German divisions from the Russian front.
I happened to see this notice on the notice board asking for volunteers for sunny Italy. That was my first mistake. I volunteered.
On the afternoon of June 28th, the Hasty Peas embarked on ships, and with the escort of dozens of destroyers and cruisers, they sailed on their mission. The operation was the first land assault on Europe. Years of exhausting training were now going to be put to the test. The regiment met an angry sea that night, and all of its plans were dashed. The seas were so high that the landing crafts rolled like corks in an ocean. Everyone was sick. Chaos ruled.
Everything had changed because of the storm in the Mediterranean. And we got into the landing craft and started circling around in the water. The boatman, the Navy, could not find people he was to go in with. It was starting to get fairly light, and Duffy got a little bit angry, and he said, "Head this damn boat towards shore and go with any boat you see going in and land us somewhere." That's all he asked for, land us somewhere. But we were not too far off when we landed, and we were about 12 or 14 feet from shore when they dropped the front end of the landing craft, and we went into water right up to our belts.
The Italians in their dug-in positions started firing wildly at the landing crafts. This was 0 hour, and the battleships opened up. From the landing crafts, heavily laden men leaped into the water and got to shore. Heedless of the machine gun fire that was raining down on the men on the beaches, the unit moved forward, cut barbed wire, and attacked.
When we hit the beach, my job was to push a Bangalore torpedo under the barbed wire and blow the barbed wire. The Bangalore torpedo is a piece of pipe about 4 feet long packed with explosives. And we had this large match, and it had the head about an inch in diameter on. And when you struck it, there was no flame or anything. You couldn't see it. You just touched the fuse and then get your head down so you wouldn't get hit any of the pipe parts flying. And then just blew a hole through so that you could rush through the wire.
The scattered companies of the regiment moved toward a predetermined rendezvous, a hilltop near Paquino. To Montgomery's surprise, the enemy withdrew so quickly that they left a vacuum. Monty worried that if the Italians and Germans had time to get to the hills inland and set up defensive positions, his first divisions would be caught in the plains and be destroyed. So he ordered an immediate advance. The regiment moved off, and even though they were in good shape, they were not ready for the Sicilian heat and dust. The men had only their canteens of water to sustain them.
Our first move from our beach landing was to Gramasheli, and we rode artillery tractors part of the way, and the dust was just terrible from it. You couldn't breathe. We had a water bottle full of water when we landed. Well, that's all the water we had for 3 days, and so we had to ration that pretty tight.
On June 12, 1943, they halted. The main objective of the attack on Sicily was to capture the crossings to the Italian mainland at the Straits of Messina. A three-pronged approach developed out of necessity. The British 8th Army, which included the 1st Canadian Division, were to advance up the mountainous central area. The 13th Corps was to advance up the east coastal road, and the American 7th Army to advance up the west coast. The Germans were crack troops, composed mainly of the experienced and battle-hardened Afrika Korps. They were helped by the extremely dangerous mountainous terrain. The Germans were confident that they could hold these positions and grind the Allied operation to a halt. On the morning of July 15th, the regiment was at the front of the division. As they approached Grammichele, they came under withering enemy fire.
When we went into Gramasheli, they let us walk into the town, and then they opened up on us. And these mortars were, well, a mortar blew me off my motorcycle.
This was the German tactic. They allowed us to come in. We got really beyond the range of our guns, and our tanks were behind, and then they hit us.
It seemed for a time that their ambush would see the total destruction of the Hasty Peas. With the aid of their own artillery, tanks, and self-propelled British 25-pounder guns, B Company got into Grammichele and threatened the Germans' retreat. The swiftness of the regiment's attack, even though it had been ambushed, was a surprise to the Germans. They retreated and left many of their weapons behind.
We attacked Gramasheli in Sicily the same way we were taught to attack in Sussex.
Through instinct more than anything and training, we piled off the vehicles and went up the slopes, both sides, and got up into a counterattack position, and Germans weren't expecting that, so we took them out quite easily.
Probably the only attack we ever put in where everything went according to Hoyle. And the first thing the Germans knew, we had guys in the town and their mortars got knocked out, and they got out of town.
The Canadian 1st Division was steadily moving up through the mountainous heart of Sicily. The Germans knew that they had to prevent them from getting any further north. They established themselves at the Leonforte Asaro area, a mountain that thrust up out of the valley floor. Here, the formidable 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was to hold. The Germans commanded the high ground. By July the 20th, the Edmontons reached the Ditiano River and established a bridgehead. There were only 2 narrow roads leading up the cliffs of Asaro, and they were extremely well guarded from the heights. Major Lord John Tweedsmuir, a British officer attached to the unit earlier on, took over command and put a daring plan into effect. The regiment was ordered to do a wide right-flanking maneuver and to scale the cliff to the town of Asaro, nearly 3,000 feet up from the valley floor. On top of the German-held mountain were the ruins of a castle built by the Norman king Roger II. The castle had never been taken.
We had confidence in Bruce Sutcliffe. It could be done if he said so. Colonel Bruce Sutcliffe made the reckoning, and he was killed.
It made us a little bit upset and angry that, we've lost our very good commanding officer. And so we thought, if we could take that place, we'd take it in honor of him.
Who in the bloody world would send soldiers up to do a thing like that? Absolute stupidity. At night to climb a 1,000-foot rock or something like that, nobody in his bright mind would send soldiers to do that. But we did it.
Absolute silence had to be maintained if the regiment was to survive. At 0400 hours, they reached their objective and started to climb. From ledge to ledge, the men moved themselves and their equipment up. It was a miracle that no sound was made and no alarm given. The Germans were taken by complete surprise.
It was getting daylight, and we desperately climbed, and you just desperately hung on. And we got up there to the top, and then, of course, it's fine to be on the top of the hill, but there's no place else to go unless you can drive the people away. Well, we couldn't down below, so we took tremendous shelling.
From Leonforte, the Germans swung their 88mm artillery and started shelling the Asaro Ridge. The regiment had to dig in.
We were caught right on a corner by heavy artillery fire and machine gun. And we didn't lose too many men, but we had some wounded. I got in a position where I was trying to see where the fire was coming from because I had already set my mortar up. And a man from Trenton, Tiny Hyatt, was on one side, and a fellow that came from Niagara was on the other side. And we were in a little place where I could get a good look at where the fire was coming from. And a machine gun picked us up, and it swung across, hit Tiny, hit the other fellow, and I never got a scratch. And we were laying shoulder to shoulder. It's impossible, but it happened.
In the first 2 hours of battle, more than 400 shells crashed into the crest of Asaro. The German infantry counterattacked, and the situation for the regiment became desperate. The enemy's artillery had to be silenced, or the regiment would be totally annihilated. Major Kennedy, who had been trained as an artilleryman, used a 20-power scissor telescope found in one of the German outposts. He located their artillery, and with the one radio that was working, he directed fire on the enemy positions.
We were sitting right up there, we could see for miles and miles, and every time a gun would get set to fire, he'd open up on it and blow them up or drive them out. And if it hadn't been for that, they'd have wiped us right off the top.
There was no escape for them. It wasn't long before over half of the enemy's artillery had been destroyed and the rest had withdrawn out of range. Then Tweedsmuir asked for 2 volunteers to go back down the mountain, across 7 miles of enemy territory, and back to friendly lines in order to get supplies. This job fell on Regimental Sergeant Major Angus Duffy and Captain Bill Stocklosser.
After the first day up there, we realized that we needed food, water, and especially ammunition, because we were running out. So the RSM Angus Duffy and Major Stocklosser volunteered to go back to get somebody to bring the supplies up to us, and went to the Royal Canadian Regiment, and they offered to send 100 men with supplies up to us. And so that same night, they went back up with the RCRs bringing the supplies. So they actually did the trip 3 times in less than 48 hours, which was quite a feat. And I don't know how they were able to do it, especially coming back, because they had to guide the supply column. And it worked out very well for us.
2nd Brigade was at this time attacking Leonforte, and the Germans holding Osorno knew that the Canadians would have to be pushed back over the cliff. 2 companies of grenadiers counterattacked again, and the regiment held its line. As darkness fell, the Germans withdrew from Osorno and Leonforte.
Only men with great confidence in their leaders and in themselves would have tried that thing. And the other thing is that they were a special breed of people because they stayed there. They wouldn't back down. They weren't going to give it up for anything. Capturing this position, we reduced the fighting in Sicily by 5 days. And you can imagine how many men's lives that meant. So it was it's quite a good show for a bunch of farm fellas.
As the Germans retreated, they halted at the town of Nesoria, less than 5 miles from Osorno. The 1st Brigade was ordered to take Nesoria at night, without tank or artillery support and without prior reconnaissance. The men of the Hasty Peas once again went into battle with only the ammunition they could carry. On the night of July 24th, the unit moved up the long slope toward Nesoria. Somehow, one of the platoons blundered into the enemy. A star shell went up, and the men tried to find whatever cover they could. There was another confused battle, with Germans and Canadians mixed together. As morning came, the regiment found itself completely under German guns. The casualties mounted by the minute.
We went up to Nesoria and went into the regiment into the attack with minimum artillery support. Just didn't figure it was needed, and we took quite a few casualties that time.
Lieutenant Colonel Tweedsmuir was wounded by a mortar and put out of action. The regiment was ordered to retreat. That brief battle cost them 6 officers dead, 63 other ranks dead and wounded. It was to be their first taste of defeat, and it was here that the men started to become skeptical about their leadership. It was only after a well-planned, full-scale attack by 2nd Brigade with massive artillery support that Nesoria was eventually cleared. The division moved eastward to Rigoletto and found the same situation they did at Nesoria. On August 1st, the 1st Brigade moved to the attack. Here they met units of the Hermann Goering Division, and no amount of frontal attacks would dislodge them. This would be the first battle where the Hasty Peas were given a free hand to do the job their own way. Major Kennedy, acting CO, sent out reconnaissance patrols and carefully calculated his attack. The attack would be a classic wide flanking maneuver, but this time with artillery and mortar support. The attack was so successful that the enemy fled, leaving much of their equipment behind. The 1st Division moved toward Messina. On the night of September 3rd, the guns of the 8th Army fired across the Straits of Messina and pounded the landing zones on the southern coast of the mainland. That morning, the regiment found itself in landing crafts crossing the narrow strait. The Italians and Germans had left, and the landing was uneventful. There were rumors of the impending surrender of Italy, and the Italian soldiers were in no mood to die when peace was such a short time away. The regiment faced north and started to march up the massive Calabria mountains. As they climbed up the mountains, Italian units came down to surrender. It was evident that the Italians had left the defense to the Germans and were in no mood to fight. Montgomery's plan was for the 8th Army to land at Reggio and lure the 11 German divisions south. The U.S. 5th Army would land north at Salerno and catch the Germans in the middle. The Germans, however, had other plans. They counterattacked the U.S. 5th Army and almost succeeded in throwing them back into the sea. It would take the 8th Army 14 days to link up with the 5th. And as the 8th Army moved up the southern spine of Italy, they found relatively little resistance. However, the Germans had blown every single bridge and road going north. Bailey bridges had to be built at every river crossing, and numerous obstacles, such as mines, had to be cleared. On October the 23rd, the regiment was ordered to cross the Biferno River, which by this time was a swollen torrent and booby-trapped, and take the town of Molise. With little opposition, the unit captured the town. For a week, the regiment suffered under remorseless and accurate artillery bombardment. With each day of rain, the Biferno River rose. It wasn't long till all the Bailey bridges were swept away and the regiment was cut off. The enemy settled into his winter line of defense at the Sangro River, which they believed, to their folly, to be impregnable. The 8th Army struck the Germans hard and broke the line. Montgomery's plan was to attack laterally across the mountains, take Pescara, and then to Rome. But the weather and mountainous conditions proved more formidable than expected. The Germans still held all the high ground, and as they withdrew, they destroyed all the bridges. The German High Command sent its reserve unit, the 90th Grenadier Division, to rally the defense of the Sangro River. General Vaux, the divisional commander, had planned to take the highway into the village of San Leonardo. To do this, he would need a diversion. He ordered the regiment to make an immediate feint attack across the river.
It was just plain murder, that's all. The company that started out, C Company, forded the river all right, got across, but one platoon had gone much further ahead as a recce. And it's dark and raining, miserable night, and all at once everything started going crazy. The Germans fired flares, machine guns started opening up, artillery started firing, and there they were right out in an open flap.
Crossing of this river, the artillery opened up at night, and honest to God, you could read a paper from the shells being fired from the guns. And we were told that no problem, the water was just ankle deep. Well, we went in. I went over my head, and I was using my rifle like a stick to push myself up off the bottom for air, and just using it as a pogo stick sort of to push myself across the river. Luckily, I think the river was probably only about 10, 12 feet wide.
Dog Company leapt into the center of the battle to aid Charlie Company. Tanks, which had been released to Kennedy, got bogged down in the mud and became totally useless. Kennedy figured that the feint was working and ordered a withdrawal. Charlie Company obeyed, but Dog Company, whose radio had been destroyed, did not get the order. From his position, Kennedy could see Dog Company's 3 platoons running wildly in amongst the enemy positions. He had to decide quickly whether to sacrifice Dog Company to save the others or to renew the battle. He ordered the attack anew.
The colonel was just about going crazy. So he had to make a decision, and the decision was that he's not going to lose a full company of men. He said, we're all going over. So they went back across and were able to form a perimeter, very small perimeter, but they were able to form that perimeter and hold it. Numerous counterattacks. Every day there was one come in.
The regiment was now in enemy territory, holding a line nearly half a mile without support. The Sangro River had overnight risen 20 feet and destroyed the remaining Bailey bridges. They were cut off. There were no fewer than 11 attacks on the Hasty Peas over a 36-hour period. Here the regiment took the brunt of battle. By December the 10th, the enemy realized that they were wasting their resources on trying to destroy the regiment's foothold, while the rest of the division was crossing the Moreau and moving towards Ortona. The enemy withdrew northward with the regiment in hot pursuit. The battle for the Moreau was over. The Italian sector was on the verge of being forgotten. Supplies and men were moved in preparation for the Second Front in Europe. At the same time, the Germans were reinforcing their lines in Italy. The 8th Army had been reduced to a skeletal force, while the German army had 27 divisions opposing them. The 8th Army was in no position to carry on any offensive operations. On the night of May the 11th, 1944, 8th Army, with units from the Free French Corps, an English and Indian division and 2 Canadian divisions waiting in reserve, attacked the Gustav Line and Casino. It seemed like an impossible task, since the enemy held the mountains that circled the valley, and they were well dug in. As soon as the regiment got there, they were immediately beset by the enemy. The battle degenerated from a battalion level to a platoon level.
The casino fighting and all through, we had as much as 35, 40 men in a company. The company strength supposed to be 145, eh? We couldn't get reinforcements, okay? That's the condition was.
The regiment lost 40 killed or wounded in the first few hours. By nightfall, the enemy had retreated, and the regiment pushed on ahead to the Hitler Line. For 6 months, the enemy had labored on the line, and by all intelligence reports, it was impregnable. Between May 19th and the 23rd, the 8th Army moved everything it had up to this front and prepared for the next battle. The regiment's battle plan was so furious at the outset that within the first few hours, 32 prisoners and even the enemy's own trenches had been taken. Probably one of the single most brilliant actions by the regiment to date. On May the 30th, the regiment joined the 5th Armored Division and pursued the demoralized German forces who were anxious to get to their next defensive line, the Gothic Line. This was another seemingly impregnable fortress of mountain ridges that stretched across Italy, from north of Pisa on the west to the south of Rimini to the east. On September the 3rd, the town of San Maria and its mountainous ridge was deemed to be the key to the coastal sector. The Hasty Peas were ordered to take it.
It followed a ridge of mountains across Italy. And I guess maybe it is the last line of organized, built-up defense, minefield, barbed wire, pillbox. Yes, it was the last defense that way. But we broke through that in one day also. The 5th Division was the one that broke into that. And it took us a month to clear them out of that particular area.
It was bad for the Germans because they had put all their second-class troops up in the front line with heavy machine guns and everything, and they'd been told if they withdrew, they'd be shot on the way back. So they had to stay there, and they really didn't have much heart.
On September the 11th, the regiment would be ordered to make a final attack on the remaining stronghold of the Gothic Line, the town of San Fortunato. In the darkness, the Hasty Peas moved forward to attack a ridge they had not seen, across unfamiliar ground, totally without any reconnaissance. It was here that the Hasty Peas took 100 of the famed paratroopers prisoners and had killed 40 more. Operation Chuckle required a seemingly complicated four-phase assault. The 1st Canadian Division was tasked to push the enemy past the Lamone and Saturno rivers, capture the towns of Lugo, Bagnocavallo, and eventually clear the way to Bologna. The 3rd Brigade moved forward and pushed the Germans across the Lamone River. They sustained over 100 casualties and could go no further. On December the 3rd, the Hasty Peas were ordered to take over and push on ahead. The Hasty Peas were in a disastrous situation. A new commanding officer and a job that the entire 3rd Brigade couldn't do. There would be no tank or artillery support. The assault boats that had been ordered had not arrived, so Able Company was forced to swim across. They immediately came under fire and went to ground. Most of Charlie Company was standing against the dike when friendly artillery shells fell short.
Particularly being at night and not knowing you're getting hit by your own artillery until all of a sudden you woke up and, yeah, this is our own artillery. When the first shell went over, you just knew that it just barely cleared the dike. When the second one come over, it was behind us. So that means we're in between, and that's just what happened. And I think there was about, there's 14 were killed or died of wounds just from that. So needless to say, we didn't cross the river that night.
When it was over, Baker and Charlie companies had lost half of its men, dead or wounded. Many wondered if the regiment really existed anymore. Many more even wondered if the 1st Brigade had enough fighting power, since the RCRs and the 48th had sustained similar heavy losses. During this time, a feeling of irrelevancy fell upon the regiment. Lady Astor, Britain's first female Member of Parliament, was accused of calling the men of the Italian front D-Day dodgers for not being in on the Normandy landings. This was a slap in the face for those who had fought bitterly since the landings in Sicily.
We really felt that we had done nothing in comparison, and yet we knew in our own minds that we had done so much. It was the feeling of what people would think of us, I think, that was really bothered us. Because we had done a lot, and it was just disappointing. That phrase, I think, is what really hurt.
Right away, we got a little angry about that, and then we got thinking, well, here we are fighting in Italy. We've got, from what we understood, there was about 40 German divisions there. If we weren't fighting them, they would have been on the second front, and the second front would have failed for sure with an extra 40 divisions there. So we actually tied them up and made it easy for the second front to develop in 1944. So we tied all the Germans up in Italy.
Rumors abounded, the main one being that the unit was going to be shipped to Holland. This was no idle rumor, and the whole First Corps moved out of Italy without alerting the Germans. Landing in Marseille, France, the unit boarded trucks and made their way to Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Renison from the 48th Highlanders took over as CO. The regiment was ordered to move up the line and take Apeldoorn. The remnants of the German infantry was retreating in disarray. Many just gave up and surrendered. Some others did not, and fought to their inevitable deaths. By April 16th, the RCRs and the 48th reached and crossed the canal into Apeldoorn and established a beachhead. The Hasty Peas moved to their first objective, the palace of Queen Wilhelmina. After light resistance from the Germans, they were ordered to move to a pine forest near New Milligan, and there they encountered the enemy in force. Many men of the original Hasty Peas from 1939 died here in the remaining few hours of battle. On April 17th, 1945, the war was over for the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment.
Through all of this, there was one thread that stopped the individual from going around the bend, and that was pride in the regiment. Notwithstanding letters from home and parcels and stuff like that, the day-to-day thing that kept the sanity was pride in the regiment, not letting the regiment down and your friends.
Major cutbacks in the 50s and 60s saw the closing of many of the regimental armories until they were finally headquartered in Belleville and Peterborough. Today, the regiment provides personnel for peacekeeping duties and still practice for war.
The veterans that did what they did and gave us what we have today is worth perpetuating.
I think to maintain their status in the world, they've got to do something. They can't sit back on their oars and do nothing. And this is the best of the, rather than sending them into harm's way, they send them in peacekeeping. This last peacekeeping duty in Afghanistan is that they're in harm's way, without a doubt.
If we want to be a country, we need a military. Now the question is, what is the role of the military? In today's period, it means that it's got to be dedicated to really probably peacekeeping rather than necessarily only fighting. I have the pleasure of going with the troops of the regiment out into the field occasionally, weekends and on exercises, and I see what a tough job it is under current circumstances. And to do the good work which a peacekeeping force has to be doing in different parts of the world to assure that the peaceful people in a country can occupy themselves with peaceful activities.
The relationship that we have with civilians is very important, because I think it normalizes what the military is about. It's not about, going in and just taking somebody over and, making them think what you think and that sort of thing. It's not really about that for us.
I feel proud that I've served Queen and Country, which is what I took my oath for, which is what I wanted to do. That's why I joined the Army. I wanted to serve in a capacity that would make my country look good, make my uniform look good.
Canadian soldiers, reserve or regular force, basic operating principles are respecting human rights and human dignity and that sort of thing. When we go overseas, we're not about putting our boot print on people. We're about trying to help them get on with their lives so that we can go home too. And when we leave there, we leave them hopefully in peace and stability. So as we deploy soldiers all over the globe, and they come back to the communities, I think that the relationship that we have with civilians is very important.
There are few in number, but the dedication and vigilance harkens back to earlier times. The men and women of today's Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment are no different from their forefathers. They will be there when Canada calls.
I see that pride in the faces and the action of the current members of the regiment. And that is a feeling that one just can't describe. The regiment still lives, which is, to me, the most important thing.
We are the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy, always on the Vino, always on the spree. 8th Army Skybirds and their tanks, we go to war in ties and slacks. We are the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy. We fought into a Gira, a holiday with pay. Jerry brought his band out to cheer us on the way. Showed us the sights and gave us tea. We all sang songs, the beer was free. We are the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy. The Moro undertone were taken in a stride. We didn't really fight there, we went there for the ride. Sleeping till noon and playing games. We live in Rome with lots of dames. We are the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy. On our way to Florence, we had a lovely time. We drove a bus from Rimini right through the Gothic line. Then to Bologna we did go. We all went swimming in the Po. We are the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy. We hear the boys in France are going home on leave. After 6 months service, such a shame they're not relieved. We were told to carry on a few more years because our wives don't shed no tears. We are the D-Day Dodgers in sunny Italy. We're always tight, we cannot fight. What bloody use are we